And yet there's one biblical historical question which is not perfectly clear here. We went back, we read about the Exodus, we read about the splitting of the sea, then we read about the approach to the Mount Sinai and the receiving of the law, which in a sense was the creation of this Jewish people, this chosen people and their covenant with God. After that, we were taught some more mishpatim, some more ordinances, and then the rest of the book of Exodus is devoted more or less primarily to instructions about the construction of the Mishkan, the house of God. Once we have the Torah, which in essence is a teaching and an instrument to bring Godly's presence into the entire world, to sanctify our lives and our environment. So, although this should be done everywhere and at all times and in all places, but it needed to be somehow exemplified in one specific commandment, with one part of the world being more visibly holy than others, and that being the Holy Temple, or as its precedent was, the Mishkan, the portable tabernacle in the desert. We get all of the dimensions of the Mishkan itself. We get the materials, and as well as the dimensions and materials for the various vessels, the candelabra, the table, the altar, and so on, the Holy Ark, which I hope that you know something about. I hope that you were following a little bit the previous weeks. Last week we got the clothing of the high priest and the other priests. And the question is, since, as we see by the end of the book of Exodus, with the concluding Parshiyot, that these were actually implemented, we speak about the building of the Mishkan, we have given accounting of the donations and the materials. When did this happen? Rashi makes a very simple argument. If Moshe came down, if the Torah was given, right away he went up for the first 40 days, came down, angered by the worship of the golden calf, throws down the tablets, goes for a second 40-day period, and then a third 40-day period. So when did this commandment and instructions and then eventual implementation of those instructions regarding the tabernacle take place? So Rashi says a very simple thing. It all happened after Yom Kippur. It is true that they are related to us, enumerated before the story of the golden calf. But Rashi, in fact, tells us an important rule: Ein mukdam u'meuchar b'Torah. There is no earlier or later in the Torah, meaning the way the Torah is written, the order in which it's written does not parallel the chronological order of the events which it describes. And he gives a very simple proof that in Yitro, the very beginning of Yitro, we have Yitro seeing Moshe judging the people, sitting from morning till night, answering their questions about the commandments of the Torah. And Moses says it clearly in the verse. When did this happen? They had not yet been given the Torah. That happens in a further chapter within Yitro itself. So Rashi says that this demonstrates that the Torah is not written in chronological order. And a further example of this is the instructions and the implementation of the tabernacle and its vessels, because although it is written immediately following the giving of the Torah and then the mishpatim, the precepts of the Torah, in actual fact, it was after Moshe came down, months later, after the sin of the golden calf, and then subsequently after their forgiveness for that sin, and after he came down on Yom Kippur, which was almost 4 months, some 4 months later, and they were forgiven, then he gave over the instructions of the Mishkan, and they began building the Mishkan. It was concluded in Rosh Chodesh Nisan, a whole year, almost minus 2 weeks of the Exodus. So Rashi, invoking this idea that the Torah is not written in chronological order, tells us that both the commandment for the Mishkan, for the tabernacle and its implementation by the Jewish people happened after the sin of the golden calf, after Moshe obtained their forgiveness, after he came down and presented them with a second set of tablets of the law. However, there is another opinion. The Zohar gives a very more simplistic interpretation, which is that the commandment for the tabernacle are indeed transmitted to the Jewish people in the order in which it is written in the Torah. So first, the Torah is given, and then God gives the commandment for the construction of the Mishkan, beginning with the collection of materials. And indeed, that collection happens, and the construction as well. And only after that is there the sin of the golden calf. So the Zohar has the exact opposite scenario, where both the instructions and the implementation took place before the golden calf. Rashi says that they both took place after their forgiveness for the sin of the golden calf, and explaining that that is not a contradiction to the way the Torah is written, because the Torah is not written in chronological sequence. What do Zohar and Rashi have in common? The Zohar says that the Mishkan, the house of God, was taught and created before they sinned. Rashi says it was taught and created after they were forgiven for the sin. So both Rashi and the Zohar agree that the house of God was created by the sinless individual, because the house of God means to take the material, but not to take it on face value, but to see it as potential of bringing God's presence into the world. And the one who sins doesn't have the power to do that. Their only difference is, does one need to be a Baal Teshuvah to create a house for God? Because the nature of the Baal Teshuvah also is involvement with the world, where the tzaddik is more involved in the spiritual. The Zohar, however, says no. Indeed, the tzaddik is capable, and is primarily the tzaddik who is the one who can transform the material universe into a home for God as well. But there is a third opinion, which is the inspiring one for you and me, for the rest of us, who may not be on the level of the perfect tzaddik, and may not yet have achieved even repentance for the things that we did wrong. It is the view of Nachmanides, a later commentary, later than Rashi. And he says that they received the instructions for the construction of the tabernacle following the giving of the Torah. Then they sinned with the golden calf, even as that instruction and commandment remained in force, but did not actually begin its construction and implementation until after they were forgiven. But nonetheless, they were subject to this command, showing that it is not only the great righteous person, or even the one who sinned but has already been forgiven and returned to God, who can transform the world, but even the one who still has not completely repented. He hasn't completed that process. Even he is able, in any way that he can, in a limited way, let us say, any area of his life where he tries to bring godliness into it, by using his material life and activities and trying to use them as a mode for serving God. So he too is creating a house for God, even though he is not the tzaddik, and nor is he the Baal Teshuvah, the penitent. And this is true of each one of us, wherever we are holding on our Yiddishkeit. We do not need to wait to become completely observant or completely righteous, or we need to wait for that process where we return from all the things that we're doing wrong. We can now, because we have this commandment, we can and must, to the extent of our ability, take our material affairs and transform them into a house for God.